In this training session, we're going to take a look at EventSentry's disk space monitoring feature that is part of system health monitoring. If you open the management console and navigate to system health, you'll actually find two disk space packages already that ship with EventSentry. And they are called disk space error and disk space warning. To make things a little bit more simple here, I'm going to actually filter to only show disk space packages. And there's three because the database purge package also contains a disk space object, but we're going to focus on the disk space warning and error packages in this session. So if we expand the package, of course, we'll see all the objects that are contained within, and in this case, we just have a disk space package. And disk space monitoring actually has two parts to it. There's two things you can do with it. One is simply monitor disk space of any logical drive. And the other one being directory monitoring, where you can monitor the size of a specific folder. So we're going to focus on disk space monitoring. So as the name implies, we can monitor the disk space of any fixed drive. And in the warning package here, and they're both very similar, disk space error and warning are similarly configured. And with disk space monitoring, you have three options. The first one is to monitor all fixed drives. So this is usually the default. So any sort of hard drive that is a fixed drive, so not a network drive, but a fixed drive, will be monitored automatically. The second option is to manually specify which drives you'd like to monitor. So if there's a particular drive that you're not interested in monitoring, then you can simply select the drives you want to monitor. So say you only want to monitor the C drives, and you can do that. And you could then create a separate package for all the other drives, for example. And the last option is to not monitor any drives. So this may seem like it doesn't make any sense, but this is something you'd want to select if you simply have a package for directory monitoring. So I'm going to go back here to all drives. And if we take a look at the database purge package here and look here, then you'll see that disk space monitoring is disabled here because we're monitoring a specific directory. But back to disk space. So once we've decided which drives we want to monitor, we can then define the limits. And there's two ways we can define a limit. One is via percentage, and one is via the actual disk space. Which option you want to have really depends on the situation. The default package here issues an alert when disk space is below 5%, and it will log that to the event log as a warning. And there's a little interesting option here called dynamically adjust on large volumes. So sometimes if you have a really large drive, let's say 6 terabytes, 8 terabytes, something like that, or even higher, of course, then 5% may still be pretty high, and you may not necessarily want to get a warning if the disk space is below 5% because it's still high. So if you check that box, then EventSentry will automatically detect that and adjust the limit to something lower, such as maybe like 3% or something like that. And it will actually log that to the event log when the agent starts. So you'll see you can actually verify and confirm what the actual limit is going to be set to. Then here we have a hard limit simply based on the disk space. So you could say, well, if the disk space is ever below 1 gigabyte or 500 megabytes or whatever it may be, then I also want to know, regardless of the percentage. And then we also have the detection of changes in trend. So EventSentry will essentially keep track of how often disk space changes on a volume and issue an alert if the change rate is unusual and exceeds a normal trend. That's disabled in our default packages, the warning and error packages. So if we look at the error package here, we can see that there's really just two differences. Here we have a limit of 5% logged as a warning, and if you look at the other one here, we have a limit of 3% and an error. Right, so this basically EventSentry is going to accumulate the settings in those two packages, and when the disk space is below 5%, it will first start by issuing a warning, and if it then falls below 3% as well, then it will log an error. And of course, the same thing applies to the fixed limit, to the hard limit, 1 gig, a warning. If it goes below 512 megabytes, it will log an error. And finally, also important is the ability to log disk space data to the database so that you can actually view trends. And here we only have one database configured, so that's selected here. Disk space is written to the database every 6 hours, of course, for every fixed drive. And you can adjust that if you want to have more granular information about disk space. Usually 6 hours or 3 hours is sufficient, but you can set this as low as every 10 minutes. But usually disk space doesn't change that much, and it really just uses up unnecessary database space. So something like 6 hours, 3 hours, 1 hour is usually sufficient. We also have the ability to enumerate the 250 largest files. So that's pretty useful if you want to really quickly look at a host that's low on disk space and see, okay, are there any easy offenders that I can find on that volume that are using up a lot of disk space. So this is not intended to replace some of the tools that you run on an actual machine that give you tree maps and whatnot on all the files that are on that volume, but just give you a quick way to see if there's maybe something that you can quickly identify to clear up space right away. And the settings here, of course, are identical. In this case, we have 3 hours for the error package and 6 hours for the warning package, so the lower interval is usually used. And they're both set to enumerate the 250 largest files, so that's going to be done for every fixed drive that's being monitored. So then we have a couple of options down there as well. We can pretty much ignore the advanced button. So this is settings. So this is something that essentially defines how often disk space is actually being queried. The defaults are good and usually don't have to be adjusted. The alerts let you create an alert and event log filter that will then forward this disk space alert on to a recipient. Okay, so for example, we could go into EventSentry alerts here and say, okay, we want alerts to go to email, and essentially, walk through this wizard, and the wizard will create a filter for you. So we're not going to do that by default EventSentry, depending on the settings, of course, that you select. But if you have EventSentry alerts enabled, you will get disk space alerts sent to you. If you don't, then you can use this wizard to quickly create these filters. An option that's new in 5.0 is the ability to override settings based on a specific host. So if, very often you may have a host on your network that has a different drive or needs a different limit, for example, then you can create overrides without having to create multiple disk space packages, which can be tedious. So how does this work? So let's just say we wanted to override the disk space on the domain controller and have a different limit, for example. Then we can create a new override. We'll select the computer, DC1. It automatically takes the name of the host name that you're applying the limit to. We'll leave this in place. We monitor all fixed drive, but we're going to say, we want to know already if the disk space goes below 10%. We want to adjust the volume automatically, the limit automatically, and also get an alert when disk space is below 2 gigabytes. And if we do that, now this package, these settings here will apply to every host except for the overrides that we've provided here. So that's a real easy way, and this works for non-Windows computers as well. So if you have a Linux machine, for example, you can do this just the same. And now you have an override. You don't have to create a separate package just for that computer and work with assignments and so forth. So it makes it real easy to create unique settings, for something that doesn't match the pattern of everybody else, of every other host that you're monitoring. And as far as the web reporting is concerned, that information is available under Features, Disk. And we'll see a list of all the disks that are being monitored on this network. We can increase the limit here to 50. And then we have a complete list. We expand this a little bit here. So for example, we have the domain controller here that shows us the C drive. And of course, you can also see that for the Linux machines, we have those paths listed here as well. But taking the example of the domain controller here, there's just this one drive, the C drive. shows us the format NTFS, 14% of this drive are being used, and the rest is available. And that also tells us when EventSentry thinks the disk is going to be full. So in this case, it predicts that the disk will be full in 2027. You can click the drive, of course. That will show you a nice little chart. So here we have information from the last 3 months. We can see that the disk space hasn't really changed much. It's pretty much gone from 12% to 14%, so it's gone up a little bit. You can do a static limit as well. So if you want to see it on a 100% scale, and you can of course change this to the last, let's say, week. Set it to hourly. We are collecting information every 3 hours. So there's a lot of options, a lot of ways to report on the disk space data. And of course, here you can select different hosts as well. And of course, switch this around so you can say, okay, I want to know how much is free. So in this particular case, right, we have the majority of the drive is free. We can switch this back to the last 3 months. And since we set it to hour, the graph is now a little bit more accurate.